Hi everyone, my name's James Beswick. I'm the head of developer relations at Stripe, and today I'm joined here with David.
Hi, I'm David Edoh-Bedi. I'm a developer advocate at Stripe.
So David, tell everyone a bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, sure, happy to. So I was born and raised in Togo, which is a tiny little country in West Africa, and I always was sort of had a passion for electronics and sciences and all that stuff. So at some point when as I was in high school, thinking about what I wanted to do in college, it was sort of I just naturally gravitated towards an engineering course. My parents, or my dad, had lived in the U.S. prior to that, so they had this idea of sending me to university in America. So we did a bunch of research, and I ended up in Iowa State University, which has a pretty good engineering school, computer engineering school. That was kind of how we chose that particular school.
And so what was your first programming language at college?
So my first programming language in college was C++, right? So I when I started college, I was what they call at the time undeclared engineering, because I was like, okay, I know I want to do engineering, but I'm not sure what kind. I remember I was actually at first sort of going towards more of aerospace engineering. That seemed cool to me, and then just kind of, as I went through the courses, I realized that computer engineering was just more versatile, right? You can go so many directions with that. You can end up in a lot of different industries. So I chose that instead. But yeah, to answer your question, my first programming language was C++, because that was sort of, like the basics for a lot of the courses that I was taking at the time. But now that you asked that, I just remembered one of the things that inspired me to get into programming was that back in the day, I'm sort of dating myself here, but remember those programming calculators?
Yeah.
Like the graphic calculators, like TI 89 and 92 and all those things. Yeah. So I had one of those in high school, and I found myself having to do a lot of calculate the GCD and all these things over and over. And I was like, there's got to be an easier way to do this. So I, looked into the manual and stuff and wrote a program to, calculate the GCD. And I remember my teacher at the time was just like, yeah, how did you come up with this? And I was like, I just poked around the computer, the calculator, and there's this concept of functions. So I wrote a function to take in a bunch of numbers and find the greatest common denominator, right? So that was my first ever program that I wrote, and I just it got me to researching it. This concept of programming more just seemed really conceptually just fascinating to me. How you can just take a bunch of inputs, feed it into something, and you spit something out to perform an action or whatever, or give you some information. So
and C++. I actually started with C++ as well, so it obviously gives you that great training and going into this career. But what are the couple of the things that you found hardest when you're much younger and you're just getting into this for the first time?
Yeah, I think for me it was just again, given my background, sort of the lack of exposure. So I remember when I started, again coming from Togo, a lot of my classmates in university here, they had computer science classes, or they had computer labs in high school, right? I didn't have any of that. So there was just this sort of knowledge gap I had to bridge. So, I mean, for my unique experience, that's, the challenge I had to overcome. And I mean, there's no secret sauce, right? It's just, you just, got to, work, like research, play, try things out, right? So, for me, like I said, I had the natural curiosity with programming, so it wasn't like, burden at all. I took it as a challenge. Like, okay, these people are here, I'm here, but I have the curiosity, so I feel like I can, get to that level.
So a lot of people now you're going through lots of courses and different code academies and so forth to learn quickly in this.
Yeah.
And there's this gap between when you first leave college and then you get into a job and you have to deal with bigger projects for the first time. What were a couple of the things you found when you left college, you went to your first job and you were working on things?
Great question. So I was telling my story. I stopped in college, but after college, I got this internship at. Are we allowed to say names here?
You can.
Okay, so I got this internship at Microsoft at the time, which was awesome for me. Again, this kid from Togo, growing up, if you had told me I'd work for Bill Gates someday, that was just, unbelievable for me at the time. My parents were like jumping off the walls. It was really exciting. But anyway, I got an internship there. And, it was just, okay, you go from writing very self-contained programs, right? Like in school, you have your data structure classes and you'll do a project on, I don't know, design a system for, I don't know, like some sort of like not payment thing, but like maybe a gas station, right? Like come up with the classes, just as an example, what data structures you need, what classes, what functions, whatnot. So again, very self-contained, just to show you the concept. And then I go to Microsoft where I'm working on Windows at the time, and at that level, right, it's more okay. You're building something. It is maybe self-contained, but it feeds into this bigger project, right? So that was the big thing for me at the time, that it felt very different, right? From this one project to, okay, build us, this, so my project, my intern project was, how do I describe this? So I was working on Windows setup, and specifically in-place upgrades, right? So it's this concept of you take, like a current version of Windows, and then there's a new version coming out. And so taking people from the old to the new version, you want to make sure that their documents are preserved, that their applications are not broken, that their printer drivers and all that stuff are still fine. So my project was to write this manifest. So essentially, there's a lot that goes on, but one of the core components of the upgrade engine is this manifest. It's essentially listing all the documents on your operating system, so that after the upgrade, you check that manifest, you make sure everything got migrated. So my project was to improve how to automate this manifest file. So again, it was kind of self-contained in that sense, but then it fit into this bigger, migration engine. So I guess that was the great learning experience for me was, okay, how do you go from just, this is one project I'm doing, just, to, okay, I'm doing this project now that fits into a bigger picture. And this is actually, like production code, right? It's not just something that I'm running just to get a grade, So I guess that was, that was one of the interesting things for me.
Yeah, and so also you go from college where you're largely working by yourself to working in a team like Microsoft where there's lots and lots of people. Yeah. How did you as a developer learn the skills to start working with other developers? Often they've got more experience than you because you're out of college. Yeah. What did you go through to make that work? Yeah,
great question. I think one thing that helped a ton at the time at Microsoft is they, like all the interns get mentors. So that helps for sure, and I would encourage any young developer to attach themselves to find someone that's more experienced and that they admire, or they've seen their work and they find it cool, and just find a mentor, right? Again, I was fortunate because I went to a company that did that for me, so I didn't even have to think about it. And frankly, I just didn't know to look for a mentor. But so they assigned me one, and I was like, yeah, this is super helpful because they help you navigate everything, right? From like helping with the technical side of things, to just working with other people, like participation in meetings, just like project management side of things too. So that would be my big piece of advice is like learn from other people.
Yeah. And legacy systems, I mean, this is something that everybody, largely speaking, deals with when they go into an enterprise. Everybody thinks we'll be working on greenfield new applications, but in reality, you're dealing with a lot of legacy. What are a couple of the things you found were important when you're working with this type of mammoth system that's been there for a long time, and there's a lot of technical debt and all that kind of thing?
I have to think about that one for a bit. But the fascinating thing about Windows is just the scale, right? It was thousands of engineers working on this one project, and I think so some features were evolving less faster than others, right? Just by the nature of it, like you take the kernel, for instance, that's sort of the core of the OS. So it was any change there gets a lot of scrutiny. So I guess just seeing that difference in dynamic where you have some things where some features of the operating system that are changing almost daily, and check-ins are going in, and then the kernel guys are like, it's almost like you gotta get some sort of government level approval to make changes there. So that was another thing that was interesting for me to see is, you were asking about legacy systems. So in Windows you have some features that just move a lot more slowly than others because they're so core to the operating system, and this applies for any operating system. So that was another interesting thing for me to see. It's just how do you ultimately this is all part of the same system. They're moving at different paces, right? So with that, one thing that I found interesting is, or another thing that I learned that I didn't have exposure to in school was this whole concept of like version control, like code branches, right? So for instance, the kernel had their branch, which probably went through more rigorous testing and just was moving at a different pace. Then you had maybe like the UI branches here that were moving faster, but then eventually they converge up here, right? So again, just seeing all these different, moving pieces and how things came together was fascinating for me.
So it's amazing to me you went from college to such a huge project, because I mean there really aren't any projects bigger than Windows I can think of.
Yeah, seriously.
Just enormous.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have for people when they're taking on these huge projects? How do you actually learn what you need to do the job?
That's a great question. I would say start small. Just keep it. It's like they always tell you, right? When you're trying to solve a complex problem, break it down to the smallest piece possible. So take that approach here, because otherwise it feels like you're drinking from a fire hose and there's just too much going on. So start with the basic. Like I said, for me, being an intern there helped because they gave me a small project that fit into a bigger picture, but it was sort of self-contained enough that I had control over it. So that means my advice: don't try to do too much at once. Just start small. Again, lean on people that are more experienced to help you sort of whittle things down to like a manageable piece.
So when did you go from being a developer to a developer advocate?
That's a great question. So I was at Microsoft for quite a long time and wore different hats there. And I found that one consistent theme, as I progressed in my career was just I liked interacting with customers and external users. So during my engineering days, I would get random exposure to external customers. Like when I worked on Windows, we would do what we called OEM tours. So OEMs are, like your Dells and Toshibas and computer manufacturers, obviously heavy Windows partners. So we would travel to these OEMs and help them install whatever new version of Windows is coming out. And as I mentioned earlier, I worked on setup and upgrade. So we'd make sure that all their applets, like Dell had their own, printing system, and Toshiba would have their, their own like apps on the device. So just making sure that those things worked with whatever new OS we came out with, and those experiences, it was very appealing to me, right? Just understanding how the end user, or at least an external user, the end user would have been the actual person buying the laptop, but there's somebody external to the company, how they viewed our product, right? Because when you're a developer, it's cool, you're building stuff, but sometimes you're so far removed from the end user that you don't have that perspective, so it just really helps, at least for me, I found it fascinating to go outside, and sometimes the things they're talking about has nothing to do, or you just don't even think about it because it's not part of your day-to-day. Sometimes you're just so focused on building this feature that you don't really look at it from like a customer's perspective, right? So that I had those kind of experiences, at Microsoft, and the more I went, progressing my career, I just I started seeking out roles that would allow me to do that as part of my job description, So eventually, I left, left Microsoft, decided to try something new, ended up at Stripe, and I took on a role of integration engineer at Stripe. So basically, that role consisted in just working with external Stripe users, oftentimes enterprises, that are integrating Stripe, right? So it's kind of a post-sales role where a lot of the time they've signed contracts with Stripe, but then they need to actually integrate, right? So trying to think one that I can mention publicly, but so that was kind of the progression from sort of like an engineer to an external facing role at Stripe, and then after a couple of years in integration engineering, I sought out a DevRel position because I just wanted to try that as well.
What were the biggest challenges for you coming from something like Microsoft, where Windows is vast, you're working as a developer, you're not really meeting Windows users as such because of the nature of what it is.
Right.
What was your biggest challenge then going into integration engineering, where you're working so closely with customers?
Yeah, I would say that was the challenge, working so closely with customers, because you would hear directly from them. Yeah. You would hear the things they're happy about, but you would hear their gripes. You were like the front lines of Stripe, right? And so when you're in that role, they take you to be the expert on all things, Stripe or whatever company you work for, which is just not the case, right? Like there's only so much. I mean, these roles give you a lot of breadth a lot of times, but you're not always able to go deep, or you might go deep in a couple areas, but there's no way you're gonna have the same level of depth on all the features, products of a company. So that was the challenge for me, is just having no air cover. Like this person is mad at something, about Stripe, right? And I'm here on the front lines, just kind of taking all the vitriol, right? And I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, I hear you. So it just this forces you to really develop that empathy, for users. And again, that was one of the reasons I got into the role in the first place. So it just sort of confirmed some of the things I expected of that role. But it was definitely a change of just like perspective, right? So I would say, that was one of the challenges I faced,
So now you're a developer advocate, and there aren't really that many of us in terms of the industry. It seems still a role that's fairly small in many companies. But what do you think are the qualities that make somebody a good developer advocate?
I was talking about empathy earlier. I think that's a huge one. I think being able to relate to the frustrations that people have with your product, and and just not taking it personal, right? Just understanding that this is just somebody like a developer trying to be productive and build a product. And if you take a company like Stripe, a product like Stripe, it's a means to an end, right? I mean, I love Stripe, but people are usually building something on top of Stripe, right? So they want to be unblocked, right? So sometimes their frustrations can come out in ways right? In very angry ways, let's put it that way. And you just gotta have that empathy and understand that, like, again, where they're coming from is they want to fix this thing and move on with the rest of the project. So I'd say empathy is definitely one. I'd say curiosity, because we're in a fast evolving industry, right? So just keeping an eye out there and ears to the ground. Seeing what's coming out, what's new, the new trends, and all that sorts of stuff. And for me, one thing I like a lot about this role is the community aspect. I really like going out, meeting developers, seeing what they're doing. It's very energizing for me. I always hear cool things, hear about cool projects that people are working on. So, that I would say, personally for me, the community aspect is huge as well.
Yeah. So, as a developer advocate, people ask me this question a lot, so I'll ask you. But often we have to stand on stage and talk to lots of people, and it's not something you've probably done before. Developers are fairly introverted.
Yeah.
We work in small teams.
Right.
What was that like for you, and how did you learn the skills to do that effectively?
Yeah, great question. Again, this is, you'll notice, I tend to say this a lot, but my philosophy in general when I'm learning something new is, how do I take it, break it down to the smallest, most granular thing. So for presentations, for me, this is how do I do this in meetings, or before getting to the point where I'm, let's say, speaking at a conference and getting up on stage and those sort of things. It's like, maybe I do this in a smaller setting, smaller audience, maybe a friendly audience. So with my integration engineering role, I got those sort of opportunities. Because oftentimes with those roles, you're doing demos, you're doing demos to groups of people. And even prior to that, Microsoft, I got some of those opportunities too. I got to go teach folks how to do different things. With Windows, like build Windows apps, which is a throwback. But so for me, I had some of those opportunities to speak publicly. But again, my advice for someone who might be starting out and is a little nervous is find a small audience to start. And again, friendly audience. There's Toastmasters. They are. I don't know how to describe them. They're a group that helps people get comfortable with public speaking. And I know they do meetups pretty much all over the place. So I think I went to a couple of those. So they'll give you prompts where you can get on stage and practice, speaking. So, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, reading slides is one thing, but doing live demos is a whole other problem. And things tend to go wrong when you're on the stage. So how do you deal with that when you're working with a demo? Often you're coding live in front of hundreds of people, and something bad happens.
Right. Well, my answer to that is probably you stay away from live demos as much as you can. Just do videos. But no, sometimes you can't get around live demos. My thing is, usually have a fallback, have plan B just in case, because the worst thing that could happen is you get up, you're trying to do a live demo, it's not working, and you're just sitting there, sort of, trying to buy time. I guess it's really awkward, right? So, my philosophy with that is just have a fallback. Maybe you're trying to show you're trying to do live coding, but for whatever reason it's not working, just have slides that you can just revert to. So that's my approach.
Yeah. Now you're at Stripe. So what's interesting as a business to me is, I've been at Stripe for only a few months. Stripe is often perceived as just payments, and so payments are not seen as being that complex to the outside audience. But under the covers, there's a lot going on. So from your point of view, when you talk to developers, how do they learn about how Stripe works when you're integrating? Because there's actually a lot more to it.
There's a lot to it. I will say I didn't know a ton about Stripe before I joined, but their mission statement fascinated me. It was this whole concept of growing the GDP of the internet, which I found very fascinating, right? It's like, back then when I joined, like a handful of years ago, I think it was something like 12% of the world's commerce happened online. So it showed you the opportunity, for a company like Stripe, right? And again, given my background coming from Togo, West Africa, I mean, e-commerce is in its infancy there. So I saw the mission statement really resonated with me. So I mean, coming in, you learn that, okay, this is a payment processor, but you start to see how complex of a area it is, like to move money. And so we see that oftentimes with developers, where usually their foot in the door of using Stripe is, okay, I need to get credit card payments, right? And then they start building that, and they're like, oh, you do fraud, detection, I can, use you, for just, like you have in-person payments, right? You have this product for marketplaces. I can use Stripe to register a company from the ground up, Stripe Atlas. So they start seeing like the wealth of things that Stripe does. And it's always, it catches a lot of people off guard, because there's a more meat to the bone than you realize. Yeah,
I mean, it's really fascinating because in the US, credit cards are really everywhere. Everybody's got credit cards for absolutely everything, and cash is slowly vanishing one way or another.
Right.
But then you look at every other country we connect in, and actually payments vary a lot across the world. And largely you're not aware of that. You assume that everyone's doing most of the same thing, but it's kind of extraordinary just what the variety is in different countries of how you can move money around.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's another thing I've learned at Stripe. I will say one of the cool things about Stripe is you learn a lot about money movement, obviously, but also just interesting business models that people come up with, right? So I mean, the different payment methods, as we call them, it's interesting how in some parts of the world, credit cards are really not that prominent, like bank transfers are huge. So I mean, and also just the prominence, right? So credit cards might be a thing that people use, but just not as much. And it's surprising to see some of the countries where that's the case. I mean, you think Western Europe, like intuitively, you might think it's going to be, I mean, coming from North America and having that North America bias, you might just assume, I go to Germany, they're all going to have credit cards, right? But they have these bank transfer methods like SOFORT, which are huge in Germany, right? So and that's a bank transfer payment method, and like Ideal in the Netherlands. So I guess that's been one surprising thing for me, is just how common bank transfer payments are in the rest of the world, including places where you wouldn't think they would be. Because in the US, it's not very common. Like bank transfer payments, I mean, we do bank transfers. I mean, you might Zelle somebody money because whatever, you went to a restaurant and you split the bill. But to actually pay a merchant is not that common here. So just seeing that, that dichotomy is very interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of developers now have to deal with payments in their applications, because if you're writing apps or web apps and so forth. When I was at AWS, it surprised me how many large businesses attempt to write this code themselves. And then you find that they get into trouble because credit card numbers are kind of toxic.
Yeah.
And keeping them in an S3 bucket isn't a great idea.
That's not a good idea at all.
It's funny to me how there are certain things as a developer I've learned you should stay away from. I mean, writing your own authorization systems when there are things like Auth0 you can use generally is a bad idea. There's not much benefit to you,
right.
And your risk is you get hacked. It's just not great. It's a complex business. And let's say taking credit cards and doing payments is a similar sort of story, that actually it's just much harder than it looks, and the risks are pretty bad. So it's better to just get someone else to do it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people underestimate the complexity of handling card payments. There's you have to be able to store these things in a secure fashion, right? Which is not straightforward. So just being able to offload that to someone, it's just like why not, right? There's just so many facets to this. There's so many things that Stripe does, right? Like I remember when I first started. We'd see a lot of these like card testing attacks. And well, first of all, I was like, what's card testing, right? Because that's another thing. Maybe that's an industry term that people might not be familiar with. But essentially what happens is, these bad actors, one way or the other get access to credit card numbers, right? And so they'll go to, they'll target a specific, site, website, or business and just, write a script and try to make payments with all these card numbers and see which ones work, right? So we see a lot of that. It happens more often than you think, and that's another feature Stripe has is help you fight card testing. But again, not something you might think of when you're building a payment system. Say it seems straightforward. I'm going to take money and I'm going to send it to the bank. But there's just so many layers to this that. I think if for most businesses, it makes sense to just stick to your core competency. Let someone like Stripe, handle all the intricacies of payments.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting is when you start as a startup or with a new project at an enterprise, you're often trying to do the simplest thing just to test an idea before you build too much functionality. But then when I look at applications like DoorDash or Uber, where you've got these very complex money-to-money transfers, like you've got drivers paying, or you've got passengers paying drivers, you've got people paying different people, not just the provider. There's just a lot of movement there that's difficult to understand. And I know one of the products you work with is Connect that does a lot of this. Perhaps you can explain, because I think it's probably new to a lot of people.
Yeah, Stripe Connect is awesome. Again, it's one of those products that makes sense once you know about it, but you don't really think about it until you come into the space. But essentially, it's our product, Stripe's product for enabling marketplaces and platforms. So you give the example of DoorDash and Uber. So that's sort of your classic Stripe Connect examples. And so there's really like a lot of moving parts here, but three core components, I would say. There's the platform, which usually is it's like the core of this whole setup. So I'll use the Uber example. The platform would be Uber, right? And then you have the end user, right? So in this case, that'd be your Uber, riders. And then you have, I guess sort of like loosely we'll call them merchants, right? In this case, that's your Uber driver. So Connect brings all of this together, right? And it really facilitates everything from onboarding everyone onto your platform, whether it's the rider, the driver. They take care of onboarding it, making sure they're verified. Like for instance, when an Uber driver or rider is setting up their account, we have to do verifications, right? To make sure they are who they say they are, right? So that's another thing Stripe does, that you might not, think of, but that's part of the Connect setup, like the onboarding process. And of course, if you're a driver, you need to get paid, right? So we collect your bank account or debit card information, so Stripe can pay you out, like all this money you make from your rides, and so there's all these layers to connect that people find interesting. One aspect of it that I thought was cool was this concept of instant payouts. So for a lot of merchants that use Connect, they by default they'll just stick to like the basic or traditional payout model. And the payout, I should explain. Payout is just let's say again you're Uber driver. You work for a week. It's essentially like getting your paycheck. This money sits on the Uber platform, and then at the end of whatever the payment cycle, or they send this to your bank account. So the traditional way that works is it's on a daily, weekly, or monthly schedule based on what the platform chooses. But then there's also this option I was talking about, instant payouts, to accelerate this, where you could get it right away, right? So what's interesting about this is a lot of businesses turn this into a revenue stream, right? So they'll say, okay, well, as the driver, you can either wait a week to get your money, or you can get it right away. But I will take like 5%, so from the merchant perspective, that's an interesting way to use Connect, is as an additional revenue stream.
Yeah, I think the topic of money is really interesting for all sorts of reasons. But when you think about in the US today, if I want to give you $10,000 without paying fees, the easiest way for me to do it right now is still to write a check.
That's still right, yeah.
Or if I want to give you 20 cents, it's still the easiest thing to do is to give you a couple of dimes, and it's still a long way to go in terms of just the way money moves frictionlessly.
Right.
That I think electronically we're getting there and making strides. But it still amazes me how often I see people pull out a checkbook, in this country in particular.
Yeah, it surprises me too. I see my parents doing it. I think, to your point, there's still a ways to go. That's where you see a lot of these sort of peer-to-peer things come into play, like, Venmo or whatnot. There's still, like room for these things to grow. And I think for some people, it's just a matter of comfort too. Because like generationally, some folks are just not comfortable. I mean, I'll talk about my parents to make it personal, and not pick on anyone else. But I tell my dad, why don't you just PayPal me or something, right? But he will write a check because he doesn't. It feels more safe. It's more secure, or safer to him. It's what he knows, right? So there is that, sort of, end of the spectrum too, of folks who just don't feel comfortable with it. But to your point, it is baffling or surprising, I guess, that we've, considering how much innovation happens in this space, that the fastest way, most popular way to move money between people is still sort of like just a bank transfer.
So one of the things that I think is also interesting is think about the changes, the way that things have evolved since you and I started writing code. Back in the day, it was all about taking a library or an SDK and understanding that deeply, so you can embed it in your product and package it and ship that. And now much more, it's about APIs, because we went through a phase where people moved towards the cloud through Amazon or Google or Microsoft, and then you expected the cloud provider to do everything. But there were always these better services outside the cloud providers. So instead of sending text messaging and SNS, you'd use Twilio or Auth0 and Stripe or some other provider for your payments. And so I think now the question is, how do you learn APIs more? And so what's your advice around this? If you've got an API to pick up and it's not like a library, but how do you get your head around what its capabilities are? Yeah,
good question. I would say for me, the first thing I do is just treat it like a black box, right? Like, okay, it's a means to an end, right? So treat it as such, make sure you understand like the input, the output, and then from there, maybe try actually step in and try to understand the inner workings. I mean, I guess it depends on the use case for like what am I trying to do, right? If it's like I have a system. I have some sort of online store where people buy stuff from me, and then I want to send text messages for shipping confirmation or whatever. Then and I want to use a service for that texting part. Maybe that's good enough, right? Treating it like a black box is good enough. I don't really need to necessarily understand like how it's doing the like how it's architected and what the inner workings are. So yeah, I guess it depends really what you're trying to do. I mean, if you are trying to understand the inner workings, maybe you want to build something similar, or just as an educational exercise, understand how it's architected. Then there's a lot of open source libraries and APIs, and that would be my advice. Is just like maybe a lot of stuff now is open source. So just go to the code. Go to the code, or there's sometimes educational resources depending on who owns the API and how big they are and what resources they have. I'll take Stripe as an example. We produce educational content on just various topics. So plug for stripe.dev and our YouTube developer channel. So for people who want to go deeper and learn how the API actually works, just find those resources.
It's and you get into the questions about testing as well, because obviously when you're building something in your own box, there's more options in some respects to using local libraries, having more confidence. But when you're using APIs, are there any tools that you particularly like when you're trying to put together the whole thing and like test what you're doing?
You're asking like what tools I like to use to test APIs. That's a good question. I mean, I like Postman quite a bit. Honestly, I dabble in Postman quite a bit, I would say. Just like, especially for any REST API. I find it pretty useful, pretty nifty. So that's the one that comes to mind. But also just a lot of stuff in like VS Code, right? There's like bunch of like test libraries and test hooks like that you can use. So it just depends. But Postman is the one that comes to mind that I use a decent amount.
I think also observability can be very tricky when you're going across some clouds, different providers and so forth. And I like the new Workbench feature where you can see what's going on inside Stripe when data's coming in. But that pairs really well with what's going on the AWS side when you're sending requests from Lambda or ECS or those services. It makes it easier to understand what's going wrong when there's a problem in production. So a lot of these tools are getting to be really good now, making it much easier for developers. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think sort of seeing you brought up Workbench. Being able to see the entire journey, so to speak, of objects, like throughout like the payment process is really interesting from a developer's perspective. So a lot of these tools are getting better, because I think part of the challenge before was it was maybe a little segmented. You could see like these logs would show you part of the system, but being able to see like the whole process again, like with tools like Workbench, is really useful and like accelerates your debugging, right? So, question for you. I feel like I've been, you've been grilling me. I've heard you mention AWS and your experience, or at least how you used to work there. So in your time at Stripe, right? You're relatively new at Stripe. What's been the most surprising to you?
Well, I think it's AWS is a huge company, obviously, and that you've got Amazon, the broader thing that's even bigger, and Stripe is a much smaller company. But what's interesting is there's a lot going on. You get the benefit of being in some of this a bit smaller. There's more projects. There's greater velocity in terms of just more features and things being developed. There's certainly a lot of passion in the community and the Stripe development area for the products that are being made by the company. And there's a lot of care and attention being made. So I think, Amazon's very driven by what customers want and listens very carefully to what those features are for services. And I think oftentimes what delivers this sort of MVP concept that then stays in that state for quite a long time before it becomes something that is genuinely production useful. Whereas I think Stripe, from what I've seen, spends a lot of time on getting things to a state where they are genuinely useful before they go out. And we work a lot with the beta products, but even by the time they get to be beta, they're actually very high quality. So I've been impressed with a lot of what we've been delivering.
Okay, that's it's interesting to hear.
Yeah.
And also, coming from AWS, right? Such a huge, project, and then coming to something like Stripe. So, like, what was, like the biggest challenge, or basically you change industries, right?
Yeah.
Essentially. What was the biggest challenge in doing that?
It's really learning everything from scratch again. So I know AWS fairly well. I don't know that much about Stripe, and so learning about something new. And I think this is something a lot of developers have to face whenever you move from one company to another or another industry, is how do you re-engage with that so you learn what's important in that space. And so a lot of it, you try not to rush it, but make sure you're aware of what you don't know and where the gaps are, so you can get up to speed and become useful, especially in our roles where our goal is to help other people.
Right.
So, yeah. But I think that's all we got time for. So David, thank you so much. This is a great chat.
Thank you. This was fun.
You've been listening to GOTO Unscripted here in Chicago. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.